Because one that we learned, all schools of psychotherapy learned in the last 100 years, is that if you get people to voluntarily confront what makes them afraid and what makes them want to avoid, then they get better. It's curative. And so that's the message there. It's like, well, if something is terrifying you, pay more attention to it. And that's actually what you teach people in psychotherapy. I mean, there's a variety of psychotherapeutic techniques, but exposure is probably the cardinal technique. It's like, if I can find out what you're avoiding and get you to confront it voluntarily, you'll get better. And the reason seems to be is that if you get people to confront what they're afraid of, and sometimes what disgusts them, but what they'd like to avoid, let's say, if you get them to confront it voluntarily, that could be the future even, you know, the indeterminate future, they don't get less afraid. They get braver. And that's different. It's not like they get accustomed to what they're looking at and they're no longer afraid. That kind of happens, but it isn't really what happens. What really happens is they discover there's a lot more to them than they thought. And so they're not as easily intimidated then. And so if you run a clinical client through a session of exposure therapy, maybe they're afraid of an elevator or something like that, you get them so they'll go in the elevator. And sometimes they're often women, because women have anxiety disorders more often than men. One of the unintended consequences of that often is they'll go home and have the fight with their husband that's been brewing for 30 years. Because they're now braver. They see themselves in a different light because they've confronted this thing that terrifies them. And so it's so interesting in that story that God's cure for the venomous serpent is voluntary exposure to the source of terror. It's so interesting that that's the case. But and this is relevant to the issue of suffering, right? And confronting suffering dead on, to actually focus your attention on that which you would like to avoid.
One of the remarkable parts of that story is also that one of the scariest words ever is, if I was God, they wouldn't have been bitten in the first place, right? So they've got the serpent's on the pole, but they're still going to get bit. And I think that's what's essential about that, is just because the serpent is there, it doesn't mean that everything is fixed. It now looks like
snakes are still there.
But the transformation that takes place is the focus of the suffering becomes a symbol of faith for them. And that's obviously in the cross.
Well, and part of the faith is the faith that enables them to go look at the serpent to begin with.
Absolutely.
Okay, so that leads us to the next part, which is in John, because Christ says, thousands of years later, that he has to be lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. It's like, okay, what in the world is going on there? Because that's a hell of a thing for anyone to say about anything ever. And it's right, because what does that mean? Why would the Son of God compare himself to a serpent, and why that particular serpent and that serpent in the wilderness? And I knew this old idea that lurks in all sorts of stories, in this corpus of stories that I talked about. You know, there's an idea that the hero rescues his father from the belly of the beast. That's a very, very old idea. And what that seems to mean to some degree is that if you look into the abyss, then that it reacquaints you with the wisdom and possibility of your tradition. It's something like that. It forces that. It forces a maturation and a recognition of what's fundamentally important, that confrontation with what's terrifying. Well, so Christ says he has to be lifted up like the serpent in the wilderness. I thought, what does that mean? I thought a lot about the relationship between the serpent in the Garden of Eden and the idea of Satan, because there's an association there between those two ideas, and that's a very strange association too, because there's nothing in the biblical story in Genesis that indicates that the serpent is Satan. Like that's an idea that aggregates across hundreds of years or thousands of years, that equation. And I tried to think that through. I thought, well, the snake is the thing that threatens us. And that's true biologically. We're wired to be afraid of serpents, especially poisonous ones, and they've been in an antagonistic relationship with mammals for like 60 million years, very long time. But in some sense, the idea of Satan is, he's the ultimate in serpents. And so that's why that equation is drawn across time. It's like, well, what threatens you? Well, snakes. Yeah, they're pretty nasty. Well, there's snakes, and then there's, well, the origin of snakes. So maybe you conquer a snake, and that's one thing, and maybe the next thing is you go out and you find nests of snakes and you root them out. But then there's the snakes that are in the hearts of your enemies. That's a harder snake to deal with. And then there's the snake that's in your heart, and that's the hardest snake to deal with, right? And that's where the equation between the serpent and Satan comes, because the worst of all snakes is the serpent in your own heart. And so there's a psychologization of the idea of the predator, and it becomes something that's more spiritual, is that you're most vulnerable to the worst impulses within you, right? That's the worst predator. Okay, so there's the idea of the concretization of the idea of the serpent becoming psychologized up into this figure of the adversary himself, and that abides within you. Analogously, perhaps, is this reference that Christ makes to himself in relationship to the snake. Because I thought, well, what's the passion? If the snake is what you're afraid of, in this concretized sense, then the passion is the sum total of all possible fears. I think that's right. You know, Carl Jung, he thought about the story of the Passion as an archetypal tragedy. And here's what he meant by that. So imagine that you took all the tragedies that were ever written and you distilled them so that you got the ultimate tragedy. Because the fact that you can identify a bunch of different stories as tragic means they have something in common, right? And so you could imagine you could pull out the central pattern of tragedy, and we could flesh out some of what that might be. Like, it's tragic when something bad happens to someone. Well, what if they deserve it? Okay, well then it's not so tragic. It still might have an element of tragedy, but it's really tragic if something really terrible happens to someone who clearly doesn't deserve it. So what's the most tragic story? Well, it's the worst possible thing happening to the person who least deserves it. Well, that's core to the Passion story, that's for sure, right? Because not only is Christ innocent, he's not merely innocent, he's also good. And not just good, he's as good as it gets. And yet, his life is the tragedy of the Passion is the worst of all possible punishments visited upon the least deserving person. But it's way worse than that. That just barely begins to scrape the surface, because it's torture, and a terrible torture, because the Romans designed crucifixion to be a terrible torture, like consciously. And so it's tragedy at the hands of your fellow man, and your fellow man motivated by the spirit of Cain in the most fundamental sense. How can I inflict the most misery possible in the shortest period of time, let's say, subject to that, at a young age, with foreknowledge, as a consequence of betrayal by your best friend at the hands of a mob of your own people who are simultaneously under the thumb of a tyranny that's part and parcel of what's persecuting you, who persecute you knowing you're innocent, not just innocent, but also good, and who choose to punish you instead of punishing someone they know to be criminal. It's all of that. It's like the sum total of all possible fears. And I think that's right. And it's so interesting to me that psychologically, that not speaking religiously to the degree that that's possible when speaking about such things, is that our culture has put at its center an archetypal tragedy. It's as if we're attempting to inoculate ourselves against the catastrophe of life. But what's also so fascinating about the story of the Passion is that the crucifixion is not the end of the story. The end of the story is the resurrection. And so the implication there is the same as the implication of going into the abyss to rescue your father from the belly of the beast. It's like the tragedy isn't the end of the story, the resurrection is the end of the story. And so then you wonder what that means psychologically, because what you see in psychotherapeutic session, in the psychotherapeutic milieu, is that if you get people to expose themselves to what they're terrified of, being terrified isn't the end of the story. Recovering is the end of the story. And so that begs the question is like, well, to what degree are we capable of bearing suffering and prevailing? And the answer might be to the degree that we're capable of confronting it forthrightly. And that might actually just be true. And you know, you think, well, how could it be otherwise in some sense? Like, what's going to call the best out of you if it isn't what's most challenging? Because it's not that easy to get the best called out of you. It's not going to just happen because someone rings your doorbell, right? You have to be shook to the core before you're going to undertake what's necessary to make the sacrifices that are required to put you in alignment. That doesn't happen with no reason.